Okay, example 4a that we're going to look at is actually very similar to what we were doing yesterday with finding the inverse equation. But before we do that, I want to think about this function for a second. F of x equals the square root of x minus 2. Let's think for a second about what the domain and what the range would be of this function. So domain first, if I look at my equation, square root of x minus 2, is there a problem that could happen with a certain value of x? Okay, we can't have a negative number under the square root. So that tells me that x has to be more than 2, or it could equal 2. X greater than or equal to 2 would be my domain. Okay. Now, if x was 2, 2 minus 2 is 0, square root of 0 is 0. If x was more than that, like if x was 6, for example, 6 minus 2 is 4. The square root of 4 is 2. Okay, my lowest y value happens at 0. So that tells me my range is y is greater than or equal to 0. Because again, the smallest number that I could square root is 0. Okay, every other number is going to be more than that. Now, we'll get into what the graph of this function looks like a little bit more in section 8. But for now, trust me when I say that the square root of x minus 2 does something like this, where it kind of looks like half of a parabola that's sideways. All right, now, this is my domain and my range of the function. But we know already that with inverses, the x and y values switch. My domain and my range are going to switch. So that tells me my domain of the inverse is going to be the same as the range of the original. So the domain of the inverse is going to be x greater than or equal to 0. And the range of the inverse will be y greater than or equal to 2. Okay, so again, the x's and y's, the domain and range switch, but domain still talks about x values. Okay, so this has to be x greater than or equal to 0, y greater than or equal to 2. Okay, let's try to find the inverse function now. Find the inverse function for f of x, or y equals the square root of x minus 2. Just like before when we were doing this, my first step is to switch the x and the y around, which gives me x equals the square root of y minus 2. Okay, well, to get this y by itself, I need to get rid of the square root. So I'll square both sides, and then add 2 to each side. Okay, so this is the inverse function. Okay, but let's think for a second. What would the domain of this be? X squared plus 2. Well, there's not any problem value that x could be. Okay, I can square any number. So the domain of this piece looks like it really would be all real numbers. But this function is the inverse of what we started with. And we figured out already that the domain of the inverse is only x is greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so we have to do something called restricting the domain. Even though we get that this is the inverse, we have to say that this is my inverse only when x is greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so I'm looking at this parabola still, but just really the right side. Now to kind of put that visual here, y equals x squared plus 2 would look like a full parabola. Okay. But I really only want to look at this right side here. Okay. And if you look at the original again, we said that this kind of looks like half of a parabola. The inverse is going to look like half of a parabola.